Welcome back. We're going to start our new session. This is a very special session. It's a new format we have for CyCon, the President's Panel. This year we decided to theme it around digital revolution and political change. This panel will be moderated by David Sanger. He is the national security correspondent for the New York Times in Washington, D.C. David, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, President Ilves, for both suggesting that we have a president's panel here and letting us all into your country, which we appreciate. It's lovely to be here. What I'm hoping for the next 90 minutes is that we will have a conversation on the digital revolution that picks up very much on where those three excellent keynote talks left off, and that will focus to some degree on the broader political implications of a world in which cyber conflict, even at a low level, even at the most gray level that was described in the keynotes, becomes something of the background to our ordinary lives. And the question of how you adjust to that, how you prepare for that, and to the degree that you need to counter it, how you counter it. But remember, this is supposed to be a panel about the political implications of all of this as well, and we're in just the right country to go explore that. We've got a number of excellent panelists joining us for today's discussion. In addition to President Ilves, we have Dr. Ryan Otis of Tallinn University of Technology, Professor Tom Ridd, who we've heard from earlier today with his fascinating discussion of Rise of the Machines, and immediately to my left, Andrei Soldatov, who's a very well-known investigative journalist in Russia, and as we were saying before, one of relatively few Russians, if the only Russian, here today at the conference. So we particularly appreciate your being here.
Materially here.
What's that?
Materially here.
Materially here. Yes. President Ilves did make the point before that we assume virtual presence all the time, which actually takes us to our opening subject. So, Ryan, let me begin with you. As you ponder the question of what you've just heard in the course of these three keynotes, we heard a discussion about the difficulty in understanding, first of all, what cyber war is, and Tom's keynote took us through basically the past century of understanding the cyber part of that. And the bigger question that came up in several of the keynotes of what is truly warfare and what is simply espionage or criminal activity that is making use of new cyber technologies, but is fundamentally not intended to change the way societies operate. Now, as we were discussing earlier, being in a place like Estonia is particularly remarkable because as you've got a country that is moving more online, more to electronic forms of citizenship and participation than most countries on Earth, you're also creating new attack surfaces. One could invade Estonia without actually ever having a physical army, and that was tried once. So tell us a little bit about how you view the risks and the future of this grand experiment here.
Well, thank you. I was not supposed to go first, but I guess that's...
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I said Ryan.
Oh, okay.
That was a question for Ryan. We're coming to you next on that. We wanted to set you up a little first.
Oh, okay.
Obviously, I'm happy if the president takes the word here, but so I've been with this conference since the very beginning,
And the very first time we did it in 2009, it was actually called the Conference on Cyber Warfare, because we did not really understand what cyber warfare was, and we thought it was a catchy title. But very, very quickly we figured out that conflict is the better word, and it's been this way ever since. But every year we throw some ideas out there, sometimes a year in the future, sometimes 5 years in the future, perhaps a few that are maybe decades in the future. And I'm glad to see throughout this conference that some of those 5-year goals are being met. Some of the discussions that we would have liked to have in 2009 are now taking place, and the world has caught up. So I would like to do the same today, to just throw some ideas out there that are actually in the future. And I am an Estonian. I come from the Estonian military originally. So I am worried about national security of my state. And realizing that Estonia is quite aggressively moving into this digital world, making decisions very quickly, adopting technologies very quickly, we should think for a second what that means to the national security and to our society. Now, you mentioned that you might not need a physical presence or a physical army to try to invade Estonia, and this is true. But conversely, we are also moving in a direction where having a physical presence, having a physical army, might not actually give you control of Estonia, because Estonia might be in the cloud. It might actually be a global presence of sorts. And there are some first steps towards that goal already. Now, what does that mean, though? It means that we are going to experience some totally new security paradigms. We are going to have to figure out, how do we save the electronic state of our state? So basically, we need a save file for the state of Estonia, so that if something would happen to it, we could reload. We could reload the national registries, we could reload our laws, and having physical control might not actually be all that important in that case. Now, obviously, there are tremendous technological problems to be overcome here. There are some legal problems to be overcome here. The world view has to change. How do we approach the state in the 21st century in the first place? Is it just as a set of geographical coordinates and a list of people? Is it laws? What is a state? And this morning had a very nice provocative title, The Rise of the Machines. And that poses one of the two major threats to this futuristic digital state. The first one obviously is still the human presence. We still have human adversaries who are active in international relations, using violence, physical or digital, to get what they want. And a digital state as such can be targeted by human actors. But if we move a bit further and play with the concept of artificial intelligence, then at some point we might have to worry if our lives are in cyberspace, if the legal state of our state is defined in cyberspace. Well, what happens if a machine becomes really powerful in cyberspace and starts overriding certain things, such as perhaps staging elections and electing itself as president? So these are very futuristic. I don't expect this to be a 1 or a 5-year mark. But if the things continue to progress as they are progressing right now, before the end of this century, Estonia, at least, will have to figure it out. Now, every other nation, some are more digital happy, some are less. Everybody has to come to grips with this. But I just wanted to have this sort of opening salvo, which hopefully sounds crazy today, but I am afraid may not sound crazy 20 or 50 years from now. So with that, perhaps I will relinquish the floor.
Thank you very much, Ryan, for that. And we'll turn, after one more interlocutor here, to President Ilves. And he can tell us whether or not he thinks a machine could take over his job and whether there are days in which he might welcome that. But before we get to that, let me ask you, Andre, so as you look at the use of cyber weaponry, cyber techniques to conduct these kind of gray wars, and which, as Tom has written very persuasively before, don't really rise to the level of true war as we would classically define it. Tell us what you think the political objectives of the leaders of your country in Russia might be in using these tools. There was reference in one of the keynotes to that remarkable attack on the Ukraine power systems around Christmas time of last year. Interesting in its effectiveness, but it was also a very limited attack. It affected 225,000 users. It turned out to be reversible after a number of hours or a few days. So as an act of war or even as an act of sabotage, it wasn't terribly effective. And if the idea was to send some kind of a message to the Ukrainians, it's not entirely clear to me that that message was received. So as you look at this and you look at how Russian hackers, Russian leaders may be considering these issues, tell us what you see.
Well, I think that the main point we need to remember about the Kremlin approach to the internet is that they see the internet as essentially a battlefield for, it's actually a political battlefield. We tend to think that when we talk about cyber war, we tend to think about the military. And when you are in Estonia and you think of cyber war, immediately you remember 2007. And I remember myself that I thought, look, it should be maybe the military, maybe the security services. In fact, it was a political organization which was charged to conduct an attack. It was a pro-Kremlin youth movement. And it seems that for the Kremlin, it's an essential thing to use political organizations to do things they believe should be conducted by, say, security services, intelligence agencies, or the military. DDoS attacks on Estonia were conducted by pro-Kremlin youth movements. And because it provided a denial of responsibility, because it was easily portrayed as an outrage of patriotic-minded citizens, it was really useful. Almost the same people we used it many years later in Ukraine when we got these attacks of trolls. Once again, we are talking about hybrid war, but actually this hybrid war is not conducted by the military or by security services, but by trolls factories. And many people who actually work in these troll factories are recruited from pro-Kremlin youth movements. So it seems that for the Kremlin, this battlefield, this space was always defined in political terms. And actually, it's a historical thing. From the beginning, from the mid of 1990s, and I started writing about these things in 1996, I remember there was a battle between the Americans and the Russian generals talking about cybersecurity. The Russians always insisted to use information security terminology. And the Americans always said, no, 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 we are talking about cyber. And the difference was that the Russians wanted to include all kinds of things like foreign media, propaganda, influence on decision makers, all kinds of things, not on the computers. And the Americans then wanted to talk only about communications and computers. So it seems what we have now, we have the reflection of this approach. And getting back to your example with Ukraine, I think it was a political message, once again, because while in terms of, I don't know, of the military conflict, it doesn't make any sense. But as a political message to show to the country that it's a failed state, they cannot control the electricity, they cannot provide essential things to the population, well, it makes sense, a lot of sense.
And is it just that they cannot provide useful things to the population, or is it a psychological message that says we can turn you on and off at will? So this time it was small, this time it was 200,000 subscribers. We could do this in a much broader base.
Well, it's, of course, it's a speculation, but you see that, again, we are talking about political ends. It's not about military.
So, President Ilves, you've heard this discussion about the political objectives. Certainly when you think about what happened here in 2007, and we'll take the conversation to the present day in a moment, you'd have to say that in the end, if the idea was to bend Estonia to Russia's will, it had the exact opposite effect. So if I was sitting in the Kremlin and looking at this example, I would say, I need a different strategy. But tell us what you think.
Let me start one thing, which is that I think it's a far more fluid, what happened was a far more fluid operation. Because yes, they were, I think the Nashi were more of a cover. Because I went to the CERT after the attacks. And in real time, I mean, not in real time, but looking at the map of attacks, it was a completely discrete attack. You would think that you would have a Gaussian normal curve, but in fact at 0.00000 GMT, suddenly it goes, the attack level goes way up and it continues for the next 24 hours, then it falls off. Not a normal curve, and I said, well, why is that? That's kind of odd, and they said, because the money ran out. And the point is that most botnets are, in fact, criminal organizations, basically doing either extortion or sending Viagra spam. So they're hired. I mean, they're not expensive, but they're hired. And what happened then was that I think the Nashi was used as cover, and Sergei Markov says, oh, it's civil society, you know. But basically, I mean, this was a public-private partnership between mafioso groups that are running, were running botnets, and the Russian government. But that's nothing new. There's a piece today, actually, by Brian Whitmore yesterday, citing Kaspersky and also CrowdStrike on how right now hackers people who are good in computing get arrested by the Russian police, and then they're forced to do hacking so that they don't go to jail. I mean, which is also a unique form of public-private partnership. In any case, I mean, all kinds of options are open. And of course, knowing the high price of good computer programmers, why not threaten someone with arrest? Now, what did the 2007 thing do? I mean, first, it was most likely not ever for the first Clausewitzian continuation of policy by digital means, but it was the first time you could see there was a direct political connection. I mean, I'm sure it was done many, many times before, but it was never obvious, and this was. So the situation here was that already being sort of moving toward Estonia back then, we had been telling NATO for quite a while that, we ought to really deal with cyber attacks. I mean, we realized that we have vulnerabilities and so forth. And NATO kept saying, yeah, come on. I mean, this is not real stuff. And then we got the cyber attack, and one of the first own goal of the Russians here was that instead of, we ended up getting a NATO center of cybersecurity here. So this is probably not an intended result. Secondly, it's probably the best ad campaign we ever got. I mean, we've spent lots of money on trying to promote Estonia, and it didn't work very well, but then suddenly, if the Russians decide to attack Estonia on the one thing that it tries to be known for, well, that worked out well too. So it didn't work. Today, DDoS attacks are really the least of our problems, or of anyone's problems. I would argue the problem in the future, already now, is data integrity. Unfortunately, due to Mr. Snowden's revelations, Europe especially is all hung up on privacy. Privacy is clearly a concern, I would say, but I always explain this with saying, it's kind of a boring metaphor, but if someone publishes my blood type, I can be kind of annoyed. It's private information. If someone changes my blood type in the electronic registry where it's listed, that's bad. And as we move on to IoT, Internet of Things, with machines talking to machines without even human intervention, data integrity, I think, will be the future area of warfare or sabotage, whatever you want to call it. Excuse me, but that will be the big issue. I mean, that will be the big problem we have to face. DDoS basically means, I mean, you want to go home and you want to go into your house, but there are a whole bunch of people in the way. Data integrity, someone's just going to remove your house. So those are the kinds of issues we'll be facing in cybersecurity in the future. In a sense, it's just that since all things will become cyber and everything will be based on machines talking to machines, you can weaponize refrigerators and you can do all kinds of bad things, and we have to be much more worried about that than the things of 2007. I mean, it's so far in the past. I mean, not that DDoS attacks don't happen; they still happen, but mainly, I mean, nation states come up with ways to deal with them, and mirror sites and all kinds of alternative strategies. Right now, they're mainly the problem of companies' web pages that companies rely on the web page to make money, and then they get attacked, and then they're extorted. So,
President Ilves, let me follow up your interesting description at the beginning of that, of NATO's reaction, and then take it forward, since you are, of course, the host to the Center of Excellence here on these issues. So I agree, when Estonian attacks happened in 2007, NATO hadn't given a whole lot of thought to these issues. Now NATO itself is the subject of daily barrages of attacks and has built a large, very impressive looking center in Belgium to go deal with that. But then when you look at the question of what NATO can do for deterrence, subject of some of the keynotes we had, when you look at the question of why NATO has not organized not only a counter-offensive force, but even a theory of how you would have an offensive force that might act as a deterrent, they're not even where they are in the world of nuclear, where, years ago, they came up with a way in which nuclear weapons could be used by NATO member states under a form of NATO control. So tell us what you think NATO needs to be able to go do in the future in this space, particularly to create some sense of deterrence.
Oh, I think the deterrence is there. I don't think deterrence does not need to exist in the cyber realm. I mean, the U.S. Department of Defense, I said 4 years ago, said a cyber attack need not be met or countered in the same realm. Or to put it more bluntly, you send a cyber attack, we shoot you or we bomb you. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that, let us not be constrained by the domain. Now the next thing, speak of domains, is that, we don't have a final agreement yet, but things certainly, we seem to be moving in the direction that at the Warsaw Summit, NATO will in fact name cyber as the 5th domain of warfare. We already have land, sea, air, and then we got space, named as the 4th domain, and now cyber. The big problem with cyber, actually, I don't think has to do with deterrence or counterattack, but something that I guess Thomas knows a fair bit about. It's actually the forensics. Whereas if you have a missile bomber, you know where it came from, who did it. With a cyber attack, it takes a while to figure out. Though ultimately you do figure it out, but then, it's if you've been attacked and you figure it out, you figure out who did it 3 months or 3 years later, what do you do? But I think that in terms of deterrence, ultimately you have a fairly good idea. We didn't think it was Uruguay who was attacking us in 2007. Even though there were a few, I mean, some of the spam actually came from there, but we weren't really concerned about that. And I think that, again, if your deterrence principle is that we are not constrained by the domain, yeah, all right, so you do a cyber attack against the United States, and the United States takes out more mosques. I mean, it's...
Terrific. We'll turn to Thomas on that, and at some point I want to come back with all the panelists to President Ilves' point, because he's absolutely right that the Pentagon said several years ago, you needn't respond to cyber with a cyber response. But at the same time, there are questions of credibility that come from the fact that we've seen significant cyber attacks that had no or relatively little response or ineffective response. So we'll come back to that. But
That
Thomas,
you know about.
That we know about. That we know about. Although to have your deterrent effect, generally, you may want the world to know about it. Thomas, President Ilves set you up perfectly on the subject of attribution, which has always been the hardest part of this. Think about the cases we've just described up here this morning. In the Ukraine case that we were just discussing with Andre, I've had US officials say to me, we may never quite figure out exactly what the source of the attack was, whether it was a state sponsor, a patriotic hacker, Ukrainian separatist, and so forth. In the SWIFT case that we were discussing earlier this morning, up here, it may well have signs that it was North Korea, but you do not see the United States government doing what it did in the Sony case, which was coming out and declaring that it was North Korea, and there seem to be some doubts. So tell us where we are in the attribution debate, and give us some evaluation of how some of the name and shame efforts, the indictment of the 3 PLA officers and so forth, have played out.
Yes. So attribution, I've just for those of you who now think, what has RID to say about attribution? We did a large project at King's on attribution and did a lot of focus groups with people who do attribution in practice, both in the public sector as well as with a number of companies, including Kaspersky and FireEye, Mandiant, two of the largest players in that field. And I think, to me, the attribution debate is exciting because there's actual progress. A few years ago, still, we had that narrative out there that attribution is impossible. But I think that's increasingly seen as just inaccurate, full stop. That partly, ironically, that is thanks to the Snowden leaks. Because we now have actually a small number of case studies and some context about how attribution is done. So the question isn't anymore, is attribution possible, yes or no? The question is, how can we raise the quality of attribution to a specific level that allows us to take political action? Now let me say, I'll say a few things on that. One, what's the gold standard? Gold standard, of course, is to have a level of certainty that could be described. I think the colleague from the US Department of Justice yesterday described it as beyond reasonable doubt, the widely acknowledged standard of evidence in criminal justice. That is very hard to reach if we're looking at computer network intrusions, obviously. But there's one fascinating slide in the Snowden presentation, which for some reason didn't get a lot of press attention. But some of you will recall the Mandiant report, the famous APT1 report in which Mandiant explicitly attributed breaches against US targets to a PLA unit 61398 and a couple of individuals working for that unit. I think you covered that at the time, didn't you?
Yes, we were in pretty early on the action FireEye was taking, so I think we wrote fairly lengthy accounting that also went right to the picture of the building,
Exactly.
which the Chinese government lost all sense of humor about, yeah.
Yes, I can imagine. Yeah.
He attacked you then.
That may have followed, yeah.
And FireEye, in fact. But the situation, that was in 2013, before the Snowden leaks, earlier in 2013. Now, in the Snowden leaks was a highly interesting file that shed light on a related attribution case, also PLA related. So what if you want to find it, it's called arrow eclipse, is the code word on the slide. And what the NSA did, and I mean this is completely public domain now, what the NSA did is they breached a Chinese ISP, like a telecommunication provider, looked for specific IP addresses that were used for the attack at a specific time because they're dynamically assigned. Then they linked the IP addresses that were used at a specific time to customer billing. So they breached different databases within the company, I suspect, in order to do that. Then they linked the IP addresses to customer billing, looked up the record, the customer mailing address, and it turned out to be 3 PLA. So that is pretty watertight attribution. Done exclusively by electronic means, I should add. Of course, it's a rather aggressive way of doing it, and you don't want that in the public domain, because most likely they changed their mailing address now. But I think it's important to see that exceptionally impressive case and say, okay, obviously attribution is possible, and it's possible to do it to very high standards. Now then, I think we have to be very case specific and look at specific cases. So let me just quickly tease out make two quick observations, and I don't want to speak too long. One is it needs a strong political voice to make a proper attribution statement. If you have a company report, even if it's an important company like Kaspersky or BAE or FireEye, that is not enough to unfold real political consequences. It has to be done, for instance, in the form of an indictment. The US administration has established that tool against the PLA and as well as against the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, probably with a degree of success, but it's a bit hard to assess without having access to advanced to classified information, how successful the indictment actually was as a deterrent instrument. But certainly there is an effect. I think we have to acknowledge. And the second observation linked to that is that we've now seen in Europe a fascinating development, and this is quite recent. Only in the past couple of weeks and months, we've seen the German government become a lot more self-confident when it comes to attribution. So the Germans have called out, explicitly called out Russian intelligence and even specific Russian intelligence organizations and linked some of their operations to specific cases. So we're looking at GRU especially and FSB and linked breaches to, for instance, the MH17, a Dutch MH17 investigatory team that's in a publicly accessible German intelligence report. That is a remarkable development in my mind. The Swiss have done something similar for different reasons and put information into the public domain that attributes several breaches that they had. Most best known is the RUAG, that's a company breach in Switzerland, attributed that to Turla, to the Turla group, which Kaspersky has also analyzed in detail, which is a Russian group widely believed to be FSB. And the Swiss government has also explicitly said Russian intelligence here. So that is an interesting change of tack, I think, in the debate, that governments in Europe are becoming more self-confident. And I add that, perhaps with a bit of irony here, that the UK government of all, which probably has the most developed attribution capabilities in Europe, and certainly access to intelligence via the Five Eye Agreement that other services in Europe don't have, has been most reluctant in terms of making public attribution statements. Whether that is going to change is very difficult to say, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Thomas, let me just follow that up with one other example. In the Sony case, it was the only case I've seen where President Obama, having been briefed on the attribution issues, benefited to some degree from the fact that the NSA was already up inside North Korea's systems, came down into the press room the day before he went on Christmas vacation in 2014, announced that it was the North Koreans with the complicity of the North Korean leadership, said they would pay a price for it. A few weeks later, while he's still in Hawaii, they announced a series of treasury sanctions that I would bet the North Koreans never really felt, because we've sanctioned everything else they've got for the past 60 years. So let's assume for a minute that the attribution was accurate. Even if accurate, does the failure to have a response that would truly capture the world's attention in the end undercut the case or the utility of the attribution?
In the Sony case, you mean?
In the Sony case. Because I can't think of another one where we've had the President of the United States come out and declare attribution so clearly.
Well, the two indictments, especially the PLA indictment, was a very significant step to take on the part of the US government. So
That's right.
I wouldn't dismiss that. The Sony case obviously is different because it was more high profile. There was all this gossip. We now know under what name Tom Hanks checks into hotels and all that stuff.
Other vital information like that, yeah.
Indeed, yes. It was a difficult, as I'm sure you know better than anybody else here in the room, it was an extremely difficult situation for the White House to handle, because how can you punish somebody who's essentially pain resistant when it comes to sanctions, because they're already sanctioned. And so I don't know whether it undercut their case, because in the case of other countries, and notably the Chinese, when I try to have these conversations in Beijing, I sense that they are really nervous about being called out. The Xi administration is trying to change, trying to rein in some of the parts of the PLA that are more difficult to control, with some success, it appears. So yeah, there is some progress, I think.
President Ilves, you had something you wanted to say on that?
It's just that, I mean, the approach that Tom was talking about assumes a law-based system. In the absence of law-based systems, you're back to might makes right. And especially interesting is that might is very different from sort of population size and nuclear power when it comes to cyber. But basically, in a lawless world, correlation is as good as causation. I mean, we cannot prove beyond a reasonable doubt the 2007 DDoS attacks who caused it. But I mean, correlation is pretty good. I mean, it's not Humean, but nonetheless, it's pretty good. So, but as long as we remain lawless, then all bets are off or all bets are on. I don't know which one, but I mean, the U.S. is indicting people. I imagine the Germans will do something similar. But ultimately, if you can't do anything about it, then someone will end up doing something back, which is why ultimately we ended up creating laws, because kind of retribution in a feudal world wasn't very productive, which is why I'm optimistic ultimately about a set of rules coming about, because, I mean, right now, country X does something really bad, but someone is going to get back at them. And this will ultimately lead to a sort of some kind of treaty-based thing, but we're not there yet.
So picking up on that same theme, Ryan, as you hear this, you've described a world in which we're going to have many more attack surfaces. And those attack surfaces give new opportunities for the attackers to hide their true identity, particularly the narrower the attack is. If you go after a few autonomous vehicles, cars, whatever, if you go after some very targeted electronic targets, deniability becomes relatively easier. Attribution can become all that much harder. So how do you see your way around the trap that President Ilves has just described for us here, where you suspect you know who it was, but you may not know it to a level of certainty that you could justify retaliation.
Right. Just a thought first. This is not new. It is not that attribution is hard in cyber alone. Attribution tends to be hard, in any kind of conflict. I mean, we still have countries who, with a straight face, say that, there were no Russian troops in Ukraine. With a straight face, today. So it is not a cyber-specific problem. And as with all the other, let's say, fields of conflict, attribution is not limited to the same field. So cyber attribution doesn't have to come through cyber. It is going to use cyber elements. So examples that Thomas used here. But it is also going to use human intelligence. It is going to use image intelligence, signals intelligence, anything that is out there. And we should not underestimate the cui bono question, right? So who benefits from a specific act? Like the example of Uruguay, right? Actually, one of the graphs that I've seen from the 2007 attacks, Egypt was the #1 contributor to the denial of service traffic that came towards Estonia. I don't think we have any specific quarrels with Egypt, nor do we have any strong quarrels with the #2 on the list, which was United States, or #3, which was Vietnam. So we should not let ourselves be trapped into this very narrow definition of attribution. And moving beyond this, eventually somebody is going to have to make a decision. That somebody most likely is going to be either an elected official or a self-appointed official, depending on the country. And their decision is going to be strongly dependent on their risk for their appetite for risk. Right? Mm-hmm. Some of them will accept a much lower threshold of attribution. Some of them are happy to start a war because you just look too fishy. And I think it was...
Well, that's a huge risk in and of itself. President Ilves, did you have something else you wanted to add there?
Well, I was touched by, actually, Ryan said, but, and it's switching the topic slightly, but I think when we talk about cybersecurity, with the exception of DDoS attacks, which are just basically which is an accessibility issue, that we really have to completely rethink the nature of identity. This, idea of Jonathan Zittrain, if this means anything to anyone, but who's at Harvard doing law and cyber, but he points out that the current model of security in cyberspace is based on the BitNet model. And some people may here even remember BitNet. Basically 3,000 academics sending emails between universities. And there it was sufficient to have an email address and a password. This is not enough for a billion or several billion person and even more billion addresses today. A single password is ridiculous. It just doesn't do anything. And so we have to, companies that have internal mails and companies that have external access, governments, State Department, now I think has gone over to two-factor IDs, at least internally. If you don't have that, if you're just accessible with a single password, forget it. Don't be surprised. We have to rethink the model of authentication, identification, if we're going to continue without any, to avoid real big disasters. Sony, it's not hard to hack anybody who simply has a single password that you can get into. And we can think of all kinds of political figures who use insecure communication. Some of them are running for president. This is not we can't do that anymore. And that's going to be, I think, a huge problem to change that we all go over to a more secure identification system. I have my own ideas on how that should be, but certainly, the minimum is two-factor, RSA 2048 and all that other good stuff. But if we continue with the current model, we're going to just have disaster after disaster after disaster. And that's where I mean, if you don't know who's sending you an email, you're just, I might think it's Ryan, but it turns out to be, Ruslan.
But Thomas, your own presentation this morning made clear that as the internet developed, it was based on a model that if you had access to the machine, you were a trusted character to begin with. That was the concept of the initial IARPA way that became what ultimately became the World Wide Web. So if we take President Ilves's thought to its next logical point, you'd basically have to redesign the internet from the ground up if you wanted security to be first in mind, because otherwise you're putting in a series of patches in a series of different places. And so you have the State Department discovering two-factor authentication in 2016, probably 10 years after they should have.
Yeah. Well,
We'll separate for that from the fact that not all of their employees were on their own system.
yeah,
Right?
yes. Well, I mean, the problem with the internet is it's used by people, really. And
It's always people who mess this stuff up, isn't it?
so that problem will not go away, even if we redesign the internet, which, by the way, I think will just not happen. But there are a few security practices. I mean, let's just do the test in the room. Who in this room, can I ask for a show of hands, who in this room is using for their main private email account, the one you use to sign up for things that could get breached, which is basically anything? Who is using two-factor authentication?
And if you use state.gov, you don't count, okay? Okay, we don't see, I would say we saw maybe 20 hands.
Yeah, this is shocking, really, in this audience. This should be 100% turnout. So, do we need more evidence? I think that's really if you're not using two-factor authentication, and I would actually add, if you're not using a password manager either, at least for almost all your passwords, you're probably not safe. It's as straightforward as that. But David, yeah.
Sure, please.
Before we move away from the North Korea case, I mean, I'd love to return the question to you, actually, because a question related to the press coverage. Do you personally think North Korea hacked Sony? And if so, why? Why are you convinced?
It's a very good question. And you may recall that after President Obama came out and made the statement that he made in 2014, for the next few weeks, there was all kinds of second guessing, which was fascinating. You had the U.S. government come out with a very rare attribution statement, and then people were out saying, no, it was two kids in South Carolina in a basement, and then you had other people saying it was, a criminal group, it was this group and that. In the end, what persuaded me were the intercepts that the U.S. government had of North Korean leadership discussing the effects of all of this. And you also had the series of threats that that had been made against Sony at the time they were getting ready to go release what was a truly terrible movie called The Interview, which sort of had the concept of an assassination of Kim Jong-un. I think that if you then look for motive, that takes you there pretty quickly. Do I think they did it alone? No. Do I think they needed to hire some help? Absolutely. I mean, how is it that an inside hacker within North Korea would know that a series of emails about the phenomenal salaries received by Hollywood executives and the amount they spent on lunch at the Beverly Hills Hotel would actually create any kind of a public storm? You had to have some outside sensitivity about what the nature of that data would be. And I think living in the North Korean system, it would be hard to understand that a series of emails about Angelina Jolie would have a whole lot of repeater effect.
When you said, Thomas, about there are always people, I mean, one of the things I always throw out there, it's not directly related, but I mean, we have made all this stuff about Snowden. I think one thing to keep in mind is that when it comes to cybersecurity, and especially in the private sector, I mean, every bank, every large corporation should worry about their own Snowden. I mean, okay, maybe Snowden did it for ideological reasons, but there are all kinds of people out there who have sysadmin privileges, who basically feel underpaid or something, or can get a good deal or something. So, I mean, we are turning everything like Snowden. But I think the human side of cybersecurity, sysadmins who are bought by other people, sysadmins who are bought by governments, sysadmins who are bought by mafias. I mean, these are all big problems we have to think about too.
But Andre, that takes me to a question I wanted to ask you. So Mr. Snowden has been living in Russia since this set of events happened. And clearly there was an effort in taking him in and giving him a place to live to send a political message as well. Because at this point, Snowden's intelligence utility to the Russian government must be pretty minimal. I mean, they didn't need Snowden themselves to get at these documents. The documents were, by and large, published, or at least those that have come out already. So when you think again about the motivations of the Russian government as they use cyber and so forth, give us the corollary of what advantage are they gaining by being Mr. Snowden's host?
Well, the thing is that, of course, there's some external things, like it's always good to portray, to have Vladimir Putin as someone who defends the human rights worldwide, including the United States, and it's good for propaganda reasons. But also, to have Snowden inside of the country was extremely helpful, because that was actually the moment the Kremlin started its large-scale offensive against internet freedoms in the country, because of the Moscow protests in 2011 and 2012. The biggest problem the Russian security services faced then was that they understood that social media were instrumental to get people to the streets. But given the fact that the most advanced part of the society in Moscow and in big towns, they use Facebook and not Vkontakte, which is the largest Russian language social media. So they did not have any means to deal with Facebook and Twitter and Google and Gmail. That was the biggest problem. What to do with services which use HTTPS? It's a big problem, actually. How to crack HTTPS, how to get inside of the systems. So the basic idea was to use Snowden revelations, to exploit these revelations, saying, look, now we need to protect privacy of Russian citizens, and under pretext of protection of privacy of Russian citizens, we need to force global companies to move their servers to Russia. And we got a special legislation very soon, actually in a year, and this legislation is in force since September. And the idea is, under this pretext, to force all companies, from Facebook to Google to Twitter, to move their servers to Russia. Well, many months passed. As I said, it came into force in September. So now I can say that this approach largely failed.
The companies are not moving their servers to Russia?
Well, they were very secretive, and I wrote a lot of stories in many journals calling them to be more open about their position. They decided instead to be absolutely silent. But as far as we get, they decided not to move their servers. And we have some examples, very few of them, like Booking.com, PayPal. I think it's also about Viber. But it's not about three big companies. It's not about Google, Facebook, and Twitter. And of course, now the Russian authorities are quite desperate. They need to find new means, and that's my guess, why we got these big delegations from China recently in Moscow, including the main architect of the Great Firewall of China, talking about cybersecurity and the threat of color revolutions. But still, Mr. Snowden is extremely, useful because he is the only pretext the Russian governments use to introduce many of its repressive measures.
I think it's not only in Russia. I mean, basically, I think Snowden has done more damage to transatlantic relations. Everything from from politically to also economically, because, the damage done, in sort of number steps too. For example, a digital single market, the creation, protectionism in the European Union, data protectionism is something that is far worse than it would have been without Snowden, because everyone wants to guard their own data. The safe harbor agreement being thrown out in court, I'm not sure if that would have happened without Snowden, but one of the results of the safe harbor being thrown out by court, the European Court of Justice, is that now every cross-border data transfer actually comes under the legal jurisdiction of the National Data Protection Agency, which, fortunately they haven't gotten involved, but you have 28 different national data protection agencies, all within Europe. Data crossing borders is already something that, it doesn't happen at all European level anymore. Those are all political results, political fallout, legal fallout of Snowden.
Would you argue, though, that there was also some benefit that came? And it would not necessarily be a contradictory thought that Snowden violated all of his commitments, conducted acts that some might define as treason, but also did some good. And one of them, Thomas struck at in his keynote, which is we now have a much greater understanding of what the NSA could and could not do in terms of bulk collection of data, at least in a snapshot that ended in 2013, than we would have if we had not had Snowden and we were just sort of guessing about their capabilities.
Clearly there's positive and negative consequences of the Snowden leaks. But I also agree that he did a tremendous amount of damage to national security, not just of the United States, but transatlantic relations are a case in point. And let's not get started on the hypocrisy that we see in some countries where governments are complaining on one level, but then on the other hand, still doing intelligence operations. I'll resist that temptation here. But let me tease out another point that I think is extremely positive as a result of the Snowden revelations, and that is encryption. The move towards default encryption and more encrypted apps, and all sorts of products that are now available. Anybody who's now on Facebook, Twitter, checking their emails is most likely, almost 100%, in an encrypted environment, which you obviously recognize with the green lock in your browser bar. Why is that so important? Because it basically means that surveillance, and I really don't have the US in mind here, but more authoritarian countries can't get to your data as easily. Now, you just mentioned that some countries, or Andre mentioned that some countries are trying to move server infrastructure into their own jurisdiction. So what is that? Let's quickly think about that for a moment, because I think there may be basically an error on the part of the Russian, in the part of the Russian government's thinking here, but maybe not. So I'll give you an anecdote that is actually quite stunning. I recently had a conversation with a company in the UK, a major telecommunications provider that shall remain unnamed. They operate in a lot of jurisdictions, very large company, and they moved towards publishing transparency reports, like many companies do today. Transparency reports about data requests that they get from governments where they work. Now, they are facing the situation in several countries, some of them even in Europe, where they are scared of publishing information because their own employees are at risk because they have to maintain, the masts, the actual hardware. So basically, if you run hardware, including, of course, server data centers, you're exposing yourself to essentially a government's monopoly of violence in a jurisdiction. They can come knock at your door and say, we didn't like what you did there, and you should really cooperate with us. You're basically susceptible to threats. Now, it seems to me that that is the actual rationale, not to have access to the machines in these data centers, because if it's actually end-to-end encrypted, like iMessage, the data is not on those machines. If at all, it's in encrypted form. So encryption really brings in politics here and threats in a way that we haven't fully understood yet.
Well, we're going to go out to the audience on this, but Andre, did you have a
Just
point
on
that?
one comment that if, say, big companies decide to move a service to Russia, it would be effectively it would be the end for all transparency reports. Why? Because the Russian system of surveillance is based on the idea of backdoors, of uncontrolled, unrestricted access to everything which passes on the communications in Russia. So there is no way for the personnel of a telecommunication company to know what actually was requested, what actually was intercepted on the servers and communications.
Let's also note here that in the United States, you've seen a movement by the government to declare that they can get access to information on servers no matter where in the world they are. There's a fascinating case involving Microsoft. It's now in the Circuit Court of Appeals. We're waiting, seeing a decision involving a fairly routine drug case that was taking place in Ireland, where Microsoft declined to turn over some emails saying they're stored in a server in Ireland, so go serve us in Ireland in the Irish courts. And the U.S. government position has been, forget it. If you're an American company, you're going to turn over your data no matter where in the world your server is. Now, I'm not entirely sure the United States government has figured out what they're going to do if they win this case. Because at that point, you could imagine a Chinese court operating with all the independence that the Chinese courts do, saying, we want data on a set of American citizens in a server that's located in the United States. And I'm sure the US government would be in opposing that tooth and nail. So this question of geography is going to collide with a question of legal sovereignty. Let's go out and get your questions. There are some microphones around. When I call on you, please tell us who you are, and please have a question mark at the end of your question. Right there.
Thank you. Namık Kaplan, Turkish Armed Forces. Estonia experienced 2007 April cyber activity. So Turkey, in the sense that had the same experience in November 2015 after the Russian jet down incident in Syria. So we received many DDoS activity in our UNCLOS military CIS. I was in the room which we monitor at the bandwidths. So my question would be, sir, to maybe to President. One mean to protect the CIS. So is there any other means that you can prevent these type of attacks in the future? Thank you.
Well, I mean, you should talk to our National Information Agency that deals with our servers, but there are all kinds of things. I mean, get deals with other countries to host, divert traffic to mirror sites. Those are kind of basic things to do. And call it out. I mean, if you're getting attacked, then make it public. I mean, there's no reason to hide it. I mean, name and shame. I mean, I think that's a political thing to do more than anything technical. But I mean, during the Georgian War, because of the Estonian experience, Georgians were prepared, or, well, I don't know, maybe they weren't prepared, but basically, they got a lot of good advice on what to do after they started having DDoS attacks. And I would just point out, there are two articles in the Small Wars journal from 2011, and they're very good, because after the DDoS attacks on Estonia, it was taken to a next step in which the Russians blacked out areas with DDoS attacks right before they started bombing them. So it created a sort of increasing the fog of war, as it were. So in fact, this was going beyond just having a DDoS attack. This was already using DDoS as an ancillary tool of kinetic warfare.
Sounds more like old electronic warfare where you take out the radar before you come in. Did you have something you wanted to say?
Just a very brief remark. Prevention at some point always will fail. If your adversary wants to attack you, at some point they will find a way to attack you. So plan for that. Plan for the mitigation step, plan for the recovery, and that's the best advice anyone can give you.
Now, let's see. I don't have great visibility out here. Yes, right back here. Somebody's coming to you.
Hello, thanks for mic. My name is Jakub Hrashta. I'm a research fellow in law from Maastricht University in the Czech Republic. And my question goes actually to the whole panel. It was quite uplifting to hear you talking about the data integrity as the future and encryption as a tool to ensure the values within the society and so on. But at the same time, we have law enforcement using the going dark narrative for actually the same purpose, to ensure the values in the society, to investigate crimes and so on. Do you see in any way this as being against each other, as an opinion, as an attitude? It follows the same values, it kind of doesn't work together. Thank you.
Well, who here would like to defend governments that take multiple positions on these issues?
So I'm not going to speak on behalf of any government, but in general, yes, there is this sort of different approaches to encryption. And we do understand the law enforcement's initial reasoning for getting this. They want to catch criminals. But often enough, they haven't really thought it through. Because if we, let's say, mandate backdoors, if we mandate weak crypto, then who is going to obey this law? By definition, these are going to be law-abiding people. So that means that all of your security is going to drop significantly, but the criminals will still build their own crypto, which is going to be stronger, which will not have backdoors in it. So the police is not going to be able to catch them through this, but the society as a whole will have lost. So
it looks like you wanted to say something on that.
Yeah. The encryption, the going dark, you called it going dark narratives, and I sense that you may not actually buy into that narrative. So let me respond to that briefly. A lot of people, the crypto activist community is very vocal and strong and self-confident. And crypto works. That's, by the way, a finding also of the Snowden revelations. Cryptography, public key encryption works. It's safe. Now, you cannot believe that crypto works and love it, and at the same time believe that the problem of going dark doesn't exist. It's the purpose of encryption is to make stuff dark. Right? Of course, going dark is a problem. It's a logical thing even. So the question is, how much of a problem is it? Let's use the haystack analogy for a moment. The haystack, which is often used for an analogy of metadata, and finding the needle, the terrorist or the criminal or whatever you're looking for in the haystack, is sort of the assumption that the haystack, the problem with the haystack is that a lot of it is basically wet. It's encrypted today and inaccessible for search, easy search. But that means, I think, that the dry part of the haystack, the unencrypted part of the data you intercept, both content and metadata, depending on jurisdiction and whatnot, is becoming more important because you need it in order to develop the targets inside the wet part of the haystack, the endpoints. Now, right now, I think we're in a situation where that seems to still hang in balance and work relatively well. But it's no secret. You just need to read jihadi magazines, and many of them are available on the public domain, Dar es Salaam or Kybernetik in German, bizarrely. they have sections on how to use encryption. They love encryption. They distrust Apple and Facebook, probably wrongly, because it actually works quite well, especially WhatsApp. But they love Tails, and they love PGP. Now, I mean, obviously, that's going dark for you right there, spelled out.
Let's, we took a little quick survey, and I'm going to come back to you here, President, in a second, about how many people use two-factor authentication. I'd be interested to see a showing of hands of how many people routinely encrypt emails or other documents that you believe to be sensitive. Actually, a slightly larger number than who do two-factor authentication. President?
Yeah. This is very different from the U.S. government position and the U.K. government position. But I would argue that's because they're such unsophisticated countries in cyber. Once you start developing services that are computer-based, you come back to the issue that was also mentioned by Mikko Hipponen. They're based on trust. E-voting would not take, 1/3 of this country would not vote online if they did not have the trust toward the system. The minute you say you want a backdoor, forget it. There goes half, if not more, of what e-administration or e-governance is about. Because then suddenly you're not in control, someone else is in control. And so we are categorically against backdoors, even though this may have some criminal or security aspects to it. I believe the future of society will be more and more digital. And if you believe in the benefits of digital, which are sort of broader social benefits, then you cannot have backdoors. Because you will not get there if you distrust the system.
Well, President, we've seen the U.S. government deeply divided on this. So Director Comey, the director of the FBI, has led the going dark argument. But when you asked the Secretary of Defense out at the RSA conference, he was making a very strong argument. It's the argument you just made for encryption. When you read the report of President Obama's commission following the NSA disclosures, they call for the U.S. government not only to not oppose encryption, but to help set high standards that the U.S. government cannot break. So there's hardly a single view on this. Let's see how many other hands we have out here, right here on the aisle.
Kato Huopio, National Cybersecurity Center, Finland. The panel indicated that the deterrence doesn't work on cyberspace, but would actually considering going public on some cases, like we have there are some US examples, and actually making attribution more stronger, would that actually work as a deterrent? Compare it, for example, into some air activities in here, and governments actually going public that, okay, this and this aircraft with a photo approached our airspace. We will go actually take that analogy into cyberspace, and okay, we have a proof here that this and this attack occurred, and it was coming from this direction. Would that work?
So Andrei, let's direct that question to you first. How embarrassable is the Russian government on these issues if there is attribution? And it's worth noting that in some cases, the United States government has elected not to do a public attribution, even when they've come to pretty convincing evidence. The State Department attacks, which were widely attributed to Russia, for example, is one where the U.S. government has never publicly said it was believed to have been a state-sponsored Russian hack.
Well, there are two things in it. First of all, the Russian government quite got used to be accused of, increased espionage activity in the West. It started long before. It started in 1999, maybe in 2000, and the British and the Germans and the United States repeatedly said and published reports that we have an increased number of Russian spies. The problem was, of course, the evidence. And so for, say, 7, 8 years, everybody just got used to that. And actually, when we got the real spy scandal in 2010, when Russian illegals were caught in the United States, this story was portrayed in Russia not as a sign of, it was actually not the cause for embarrassment, but the cause for to be proud of. It's a remarkable story because all 4 security services involved were actually very happy with this story. FBI was happy because they caught Russian spies. CIA was happy because they were able to swap actually real spies in Russian prisons for these guys. Russian FSB was extremely happy because they proved the point that the spies they caught and sent to jail in Russia were actually spies because the American government asked them to be swapped. And finally, the Russian foreign intelligence was extremely happy because they proved the point that they are back to, say, to the big game, and they can send spies just as they did, say, in the 80s. So the thing is that sometimes these spy scandals might be portrayed inside of the country as something you should be proud of.
Well, I'm glad we've made so many different groups happy. Yes, President.
Going public, your own example shows that it doesn't work, at least directly. The fact that we publish pictures of Russian airplanes in airspace has not deterred them in the least. So therefore, what does that do? There is a secondary effect. I would say that, I mean, certainly, and the secondary effect is like the 207 DDoS attacks. I mean, the fact that we constantly have this military activity in our region probably makes it easier for us to make a case in NATO. Well, Finland is a different country, but at least those kinds of things in Sweden have changed public opinion toward NATO. I think the publication of what goes on in Germany has certainly had an effect on public opinion and government opinion about, you know, or let's say being a Putin versteher is a little harder now thanks to going public. So I think those are all secondary effects and they work, but they're not, certainly not deterrent.
Can I just make a quick observation?
Sure.
We have to be really careful in the deterrence discussion here, I think, because our thinking about deterrence is basically contaminated by nuclear deterrence. We think successful deterrence means no offensive action takes place, because in the Cold War, that's how it works. One nuclear attack meant deterrence failed, basically. But here, that's a very different scenario. It's more like in crime prevention. If you're successful at deterring, it means the activity may drop or maybe level, but doesn't go completely away. So if you look at criminological research on deterrence, there's this idea of the evidential problem. How do you actually measure scientifically the effect of a specific policy in criminal justice? And it turns out it's possible to do that, but the evidential problem is if you're successful, nothing happens possibly. So that's a hard nut to crack.
Very good. We have a couple of other hands out here before, I thought. Okay, right over here.
Thank you very much. My name is Kuba Machag. I teach international law at the University of Exeter. So I'd like to take this debate a little bit back to attribution. And I think very interestingly, several speakers have mentioned the standard of reasonable doubt or going beyond the standard of reasonable doubt. But in law, we distinguish evidentiary and substantial standards of establishing responsibility. And so while that may be the evidentiary or the not appropriate evidentiary standard, because as you have said, we need to go lower, what I was wondering about is the actually substantial standard. So what do we, so not how certain are we that we know what we know, but what do we actually need to know? And if we think about a lot of these cyber attacks, they are conducted by non-state actors. So what sort of link do we need to have between a non-state actor of this kind and a state in order to enable us to say that this, that we can tie the responsibility back to the state? Is it just that they share the same goals? Is it the fact of encouragement by the state? Is it the fact of financial support, training, perhaps instructions, direction, control? So where on this spectrum should we draw the line? And in law, there are some answers, but I wonder what the speakers think from their respective perspectives. Thank you.
So should we start with Thomas, because that was kind of where his territory was, and move on,
Well, yeah.
on to you? Yeah.
assessing the quality of evidence in any attribution case will be very difficult because it requires expertise from different communities at the same time. I mean, David responds to the question why you were convinced on the the North Korean hacking of Sony. I think was very persuasive because you picked up on the subtlety there that the North Koreans needed help in order to understand the political dynamics of the gossip in the US, etc. That point, I think, is unlikely to be made by anybody who's like trained as a digital forensics analyst. They look at a different part of the animal. And I think that there's a huge problem there. And let me just quickly observe on the press coverage of these attribution cases that journalists are in a bad dilemma here because there are so many people out there, technical people who have a very strong anti-government, especially anti-FBI reflex, and will call anything into question that the FBI says, even if it's well backed up with facts. And also there's money in being against the FBI. Case in point was the North report in the context of the North Korea attribution case. So if you're
where's North today?
Yes. Okay, the market takes care of some of these problems, fair enough. But my point here is, if you're writing about this as it happens or briefly afterwards, and you don't have the luxury of an academic to wait for a couple of months, then you will have always the dissenting voice who will never, and sometimes they're not particularly credible. So I think that's a huge problem in this debate.
And if you go read the coverage in the New York Times today of the North Korea SWIFT case, you will see that we contrast what private companies are saying, Symantec and others, with the US government's own reticence that they're certain yet that this was not, they're not certain that this was North Korean activity. Do you have something?
Just a few points. Yes, forensics is very hard, especially if you have to cross borders, especially if you have to cross borders to hostile jurisdictions, because you could break the law in doing so to get some of the evidence, which means that in the court level it's not going to be usable. Luckily, or perhaps fortunately, in international relations you rarely actually have to prove things in court. So even if you do get the evidence from a hostile environment, it might still be usable for decision making. But the big point is still about the all source aspect of doing the attribution. So a lot has been said about Estonia, 2007. Was it hacktivists? Was it something else? But one of the nice things that happened, Estonian law enforcement actually did send an official law enforcement investigation request to the Russian law enforcement in May of 2007. The answer came back lightning quick by Russian standards, that is in 4 days, and said, sorry, we cannot help you here. So even though that is not a smoking gun that you ideally would like to have, it basically shows that there was no interest on the other side in finding who was behind these things. In effect, government protection.
I'll repeat what I said. I mean, if living in a perfect Kantian world of perpetual peace and a federation of democracies, you're going to be law-based and evidentiary rules will apply. Living in a Hobbesian, lawless world, correlation is as good as anything else, and then you just have to think about how you're going to get back at them. I mean, this is the problem. This is why the Hobbesian state of nature in cyber is so dangerous. But you don't need to have absolute proof. You may need it to do something legal, but you don't need to retaliate.
We have time for just one more question before we have to break for the lunch. And I'm just looking to see if I saw there's one hand right back here. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you again for your participation in the panel. Name's Gilbert Kim. I'm with NATO. Just a quick question. I know we mentioned about how Patriot groups were used during some of the recent attacks, cyber attacks, and then also thinking about how other groups like Anonymous is seemingly on social justice causes. I was wondering, from your experience and from your research, has governments outside of like Russia or China have they been exploring the use of these patriot groups or these independent groups to carry on a state agenda? Thank you.
Short answer is yes. I mean, this is not a specifically Russian problem. We have patriotic activists, patriotic hackers in various countries in the world. Syrian Electronic Army even has the name Syria in their official title, so to speak. Now, it's always a good question of how much government involvement there actually is. Is it a direct extension of the government? Are they working for the same agenda? Is there support? So these can be debated, but surely we can see many examples around the world of hacktivist groups or patriotic hacking groups working with governments. But I would like to make one point about hacktivism. Yes, they are annoying. They do make good headlines for the press. But they have been remarkably inefficient in achieving any kind of real policy change. So I would struggle to find a significant hacktivist campaign that actually reached the goal that they wanted to. They could ruin a person or a small company, but making the government change their policy, I don't really have an example today.
Well, I think it depends when, say, you are talking about the situation inside of the country, when you have a small groups of opposition activists, political activists attacked by these groups. So, well, in this case, you might say, well, maybe some of his attacks actually achieved their goal. And also, I think it's extremely important, say, for the Russian perspective, because I'll remember this narrative, that for years, almost 4 decades, the Russian generals in charge of cyber have been insisting on signing a special agreement, special treaty with the United States on banning cyber weapons. And the United States always refused, said, look, it's impossible for many reasons. That provides a great opportunity, a great excuse for the Russian generals because, well, you have generals talking about treaties, and you have activists doing something because they're just outraged by some things, some policies of some neighboring countries.
Can I make a quick short comment? Actually, my comment is off topic, but I think it's important. This is some people in the audience, especially some of the women in the audience, will have picked up on the fact that this is yet another all-male panel. So I've been teaching cyber security at King's now for 4 years, just finished the 4th, and every year the same thing happens. The guys dominate the discussion, and the women dominate the essays. And the guys dominate the discussion not often with the most enlightening, not always with the most enlightening comments. So I would encourage all the ladies in the room who work in this field to be slightly more aggressive when they articulate themselves, so that next year when we come back, there may be a few more women on the panel. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. President Ilves, this is called the President's Panel, so we want to give you the last word if you would like to take it.
Well, I don't know what the last word would be, but I certainly would hope that that more governments and more people at senior policy making decision level would familiarize themselves with the topic. And I would just say once again here, I think one of the problems that we really face fundamentally was first described by C.P. Snow in an essay from 1959 called The Two Cultures. C.P. Snow was a physical chemist who was at Cambridge, who also was a literary novelist. And he writes in this essay about how he would discuss physics, chemistry, and mathematics at the at one table for dinner, and then he would go drink with the poets and the novelists and the Shakespeare scholars. And he talked about this was the problem of the university. 60 years later, we are living in a world in which people discussing anything in cyber, I would say. I mean, if they're politicians, they have no clue about what the math is. I talked to a group of MEPs. I said that in 4.5 years, you will have, given Moore's law, your iPhones will be 2 to the 3rd times more powerful, and one MEP said, what is 2 to the third? On the other hand, we have geeks who have no moral sense whatsoever because they have never read John Locke or Immanuel Kant. And so the problem of the 2 cultures of 1959, which was a university problem, today with technology and science permeating everyone's lives through this little thing already, we need people to do more science in government, in policy making, to understand what 2 to the third is. And we also need people in technology to take ethics courses.
Well, thank you very much. I think our next stop out here is lunch, where you can mull the question of what is 2 to the third, and President Ilves will be around to provide guidance, I'm sure. But thank you all for this, and thank you all members of the panel for joining and for such a lively discussion.
Mr. President, we have another present for you. I apologize on behalf of the organizing team. This is not a painting set, but we'll repair that. We have other presents for the speakers. Oh, thank you. There you go. So, David, thank you for wonderful moderation. So this is for you, piece of Estonian engineering. Yeah. Thank you. Andrei, spasiba. Thank you again. And, oh, there we go. Yes. Yeah, Alain, thank you very much.